When we speak of the ancient Mediterranean, minds often turn to Greece, Rome, or Egypt. Yet hidden between the mountains and seas of the Western Balkans was another civilization, the Illyrians. For centuries, they lived on the edge of the Greek world, shaping their own destiny, while at the same time influencing and being influenced by the powerful cultures around them. The land of the Illyrians was rugged, dramatic, and often unforgiving. Towering mountain ranges cut across their territories, while rivers wound their way toward the Adriatic Sea. To the south lay the wealthy and sophisticated Greek polis, with their temples, markets, and theatres. To the north and east were the Thracians and Celts, tribes as fierce and fragmented as the Illyrians themselves. This geography meant that the Illyrians were never isolated. They were at a crossroads, and their fate was tied to trade routes, migrations, and invasions that passed across their homeland. But who were they really? The Illyrians were not a single kingdom or empire. They were a mosaic of tribes, sometimes cooperating, sometimes clashing, and often ruled by local chieftains who commanded respect through strength and wealth. To outsiders, this made them seem chaotic, disunited, even barbaric. Yet within their own world, these tribal bonds were the source of identity and survival. Archaeology gives us glimpses into their daily lives. Their hilltop settlements, known as hill forts, rose above valleys like stone guardians. From these strongholds, tribes could control the surrounding farmland and monitor potential invaders. Inside, families lived in simple houses, while craftsmen worked metal into swords, spearheads, and ornaments of remarkable design. Illyrian smiths were especially skilled at shaping bronze and later iron, creating weapons that neighboring peoples valued and feared. Their burial practices reveal much about their culture. In great tumuli, or burial mounds, chieftains were laid to rest, surrounded by goods that spoke of both power and connection to the wider Mediterranean. Weapons, armor, drinking vessels, and jewelry were buried alongside the dead. But so too were Greek imports, painted pottery, luxury items, and fine tools. This mixture of native and foreign objects shows that the Illyrians were not isolated warlords at the edge of the world. They were trading, borrowing, and blending cultures with those around them. The Greeks themselves recorded impressions of the Illyrians. To them, these people were often portrayed as warlike and unpredictable. They were said to be fierce fighters, skilled in ambushes and raids, and quick to take to the sea for piracy. Illyrian tribes along the Adriatic became especially known for their naval strength, raiding merchant ships and coastal towns. To the settled, city-dwelling Greeks, this behavior seemed savage, yet it was also effective. Control of the seas meant wealth, power, and the ability to negotiate from strength. And yet, despite this reputation for violence, the Illyrians were far more complex. They traded timber from their forests, metals from their mines, and livestock from their hills. They exchanged goods with Greek merchants and sometimes with colonists who established settlements along the Adriatic coast. In these exchanges, Greek pottery, wine, and luxury items flowed north, while Illyrian raw materials and warriors for hire flowed south. This duality, fierce and feared, yet also connected and essential, defined the Illyrians in the eyes of the ancient world. They were neighbors the Greeks could not ignore, people whose mountains, rivers, and ships played a crucial role in shaping the history of the Adriatic and beyond. It was only a matter of time before this relationship of cautious trade and wary observation grew into something far more complicated. As Greek colonists pushed northward and Illyrian tribes defended their lands with both sword and sea, the story of the Illyrians and Greeks is not simply one of neighbors living side by side. It is a tale of encounters, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, that unfolded across centuries. These encounters shaped both civilizations in ways often overlooked when history is told only from the Greek perspective. The earliest contact came through the sea. By the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Greek colonists were venturing westward, looking for fertile land and safe harbors along the Adriatic coast. They built trading posts and settlements, small footholds in a land that, to them, was both promising and dangerous. Cities like Epidamnus, later Dyrrachium, today's Durrës in Albania, and Apollonia became important Greek colonies nestled within Illyrian territory. But these colonies were not isolated islands of Hellenic culture. They were surrounded by Illyrian tribes, and survival depended on negotiation, trade, and, at times, alliance. Greek merchants brought with them pottery, olive oil, and wine, luxuries that quickly found their way into Illyrian households. In return, they carried back Illyrian timber, metals, and livestock, resources that were highly prized in Greece. Yet this was not always a relationship of equals. The Greeks often saw themselves as bearers of civilization, while describing the Illyrians as wild and dangerous. To the Illyrians, however, the Greeks were foreigners encroaching on their coasts, sometimes welcomed as partners, other times resisted as invaders. One of the clearest signs of early tension was piracy. Illyrian tribes along the Adriatic developed a reputation for attacking merchant ships, seizing goods, and sometimes even raiding coastal settlements. To the Greeks, this behavior was criminal, a threat to trade and security. To the Illyrians, however, it was a way of life, a means of wealth and power in a world where resources were scarce and survival demanded boldness. Seafaring became one of their greatest strengths, and Illyrian raiders would come to be both feared and admired for their daring naval skills. But encounters were not limited to the sea. On land, Greek influence spread through trade and cultural exchange. Archaeologists have found Greek pottery and ornaments deep within Illyrian territories, evidence that tribes far from the coast had access to foreign goods. Some Illyrian elites even began adopting aspects of Greek culture, not in a way that erased their own identity, but as a mark of prestige and connection to the wider Mediterranean world. Drinking wine from Greek vessels or wearing Greek-styled ornaments became a symbol of status. Still, cooperation and conflict went hand in hand. Greek colonies sometimes found themselves caught in local tribal disputes, forced to choose sides between rival Illyrian clans. At other times, Illyrian warlords sought to dominate Greek settlements, demanding tribute or asserting control over trade routes. The balance of power constantly shifted, and neither side could claim complete dominance. What makes this period fascinating is that it set the stage for centuries of complex relations. The Illyrians were not simply passive observers of Greek expansion, nor were they crushed by it. Instead, they navigated the new reality with resilience, sometimes embracing Greek goods and ideas, sometimes resisting them fiercely. By the classical and Hellenistic eras, these interactions would escalate. The rise of powerful Illyrian kingdoms brought them into direct conflict with Greek city-states, and later with Macedonia itself. The frontier between Greek and Illyrian was no fixed line, but a shifting landscape of trade, warfare, and uneasy coexistence. By the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Illyrians had begun to move beyond loose tribal structures toward forming larger kingdoms. Chiefs and kings emerged, who commanded not just a single clan, but vast territories, uniting warriors under one banner. This transformation brought them directly into the orbit of the Greek world, where politics and warfare were becoming increasingly interconnected. The Illyrians were not content to remain isolated in the mountains and valleys of the Western Balkans. They looked southward toward the rich Greek colonies along the Adriatic, and eastward toward Macedonia, a kingdom that was itself only beginning to rise in power. This brought them into a period of shifting alliances and dangerous confrontations. Greek city-states, always wary of outside threats, often painted the Illyrians as ruthless raiders. Their warriors, clad in simple armor, wielded spears and swords with ferocity. Unlike the phalanxes of the Greeks, Illyrian warfare relied on mobility, ambush, and sudden raids. These tactics often caught their opponents off guard, earning the Illyrians both fear and respect. But their reputation also meant that Greek cities were eager to secure allies who could counterbalance Illyrian strength. It was Macedonia, however, that became the primary focus of Illyrian expansion. Long before Philip II and Alexander made Macedonia a global power, the kingdom was vulnerable to incursions from its northern neighbours. Illyrian kings frequently launched raids into Macedonian territory, forcing the Macedonians to pay tribute or suffer devastating losses. At times, Illyrians even managed to kill Macedonian kings in battle, demonstrating the severity of their threat. When Philip II rose to power in the mid-4th century BC, Macedonia was nearly broken. One of his first challenges was to confront the Illyrians. Philip reorganized his army, creating the formidable Macedonian phalanx, and marched north to face them. The clash was decisive. Philip defeated a massive Illyrian army, restoring Macedonia's security and earning his place as a strong ruler. For the first time, the Illyrians were checked by a rising Macedonian state. But the relationship between the two peoples was not only one of war. At times, Illyrians and Greeks found common cause. Greek colonies along the Adriatic occasionally allied with Illyrian leaders for protection against rival tribes or to secure trade. Likewise, Macedonian kings, once they consolidated power, sometimes employed Illyrian mercenaries in their armies, recognizing their toughness and skill in battle. The shadow of Alexander the Great looms large here. As Philip's son expanded his empire eastward, Illyrians were both enemies and allies. Some Illyrian tribes resisted Macedonian domination fiercely, forcing Alexander to campaign against them early in his reign. Yet others joined him, serving in his armies as he marched into Asia. Their role, though often overlooked, shows how intertwined these worlds had become. At the same time, the cultural exchanges deepened. Greek goods flowed north, and Illyrian elites increasingly displayed wealth that bore Greek influence. Jewelry, weapons, and pottery discovered in Illyrian graves reveal a blend of local traditions with foreign styles, a material reflection of a world in which no culture existed in isolation. But this period also planted the seeds of later instability. The Illyrian kingdoms were powerful, yet they lacked the centralized structures of Macedonia or the city-states of Greece. Rival tribes often turned against one another, and internal divisions weakened them at critical moments. While they could threaten Greek and Macedonian neighbors, they rarely sustained a unified front for long. By the end of the classical period, the Illyrians stood at a crossroads. They had proven themselves formidable opponents, shaping the course of Macedonian history, yet they also risked becoming overshadowed by the great powers rising around them. Their future would depend on whether they could consolidate and adapt in a world increasingly dominated by larger, more organized states. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC reshaped the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and the Illyrians found themselves caught in the currents of this new world. As Alexander's generals carved his empire into fragments, the Balkans became a contested frontier where Illyrian tribes navigated shifting alliances, raiding opportunities, and the looming presence of foreign powers. Some Illyrian kingdoms thrived in this period. The Ardeae, based along the Adriatic coast, rose to prominence by controlling key trade routes and exacting tribute from coastal settlements. Others, like the Dardanians, established themselves as a force in the interior, often clashing with Macedonia as it tried to maintain its dominance. Illyrian kings learned to play a dangerous game, at times supporting Macedonian rulers, at other times resisting them, and occasionally forming ties with Greek cities who sought protection against stronger powers. The Adriatic Sea, once a relatively quiet frontier, became a stage for intense competition. Illyrian fleets, swift and aggressive, began to raid Greek merchant ships, striking at coastal towns and even threatening Italian traders. Greek chroniclers accused them of piracy, a label that stuck in ancient sources. But from the Illyrian perspective, these were acts of control and survival, assertions of power over their own waters. It was this maritime expansion that drew the attention of a new rising force, Rome. At first, Rome's interest in the Adriatic was limited, but as Illyrian raids began to interfere with trade routes critical to Italy's economy, the Romans felt compelled to intervene. What began as small skirmishes soon escalated into the Illyrian Wars of the 3rd century BC. The first major confrontation came against Queen Tutor, one of the most remarkable figures in Illyrian history. As regent for her stepson, she oversaw the Ardeaean kingdom and expanded its naval dominance. Roman envoys accused her of sponsoring piracy, and when one of them was killed, Rome launched a full-scale invasion in 229 BC. Tutor fought fiercely, but ultimately her forces were overwhelmed. This marked the beginning of direct Roman involvement in the Balkans, a turning point not only for the Illyrians, but for the entire region. Over the next century, Illyrian resistance continued. Kings like Gentius tried to preserve their independence, but each conflict chipped away at their autonomy. Rome, relentless in its expansion, gradually brought the Adriatic under its control. By the mid-2nd century BC, much of Illyria had been absorbed into Roman dominion. Yet, the story of the Illyrians did not end in defeat. Even under Roman rule, their identity and traditions persisted. Illyrian warriors continued to serve as soldiers in Roman armies. Their reputation for toughness carried into campaigns across Europe and beyond. Some rose to high rank, proving that Rome did not simply erase them, but integrated their strength into its empire. In fact, centuries later, several Roman emperors, such as Diocletian, would emerge from Illyrian stock, a testament to the endurance of this once barbarian people. Culturally, the Illyrians left their mark on the lands they occupied. Archaeology reveals fortified hilltop settlements, elaborate burials, and unique artistic traditions that coexisted alongside Greek imports and Roman influence. They were never fully assimilated, never fully erased, but instead became part of the mosaic that defined the ancient Mediterranean world. When we look back, the Illyrians were more than just raiders on the edges of Greece. They were a people who adapted, resisted, and shaped history in ways often overlooked. They were neighbors, enemies, and allies of the Greeks. They challenged Macedonia, forced Philip II and Alexander to reckon with them, and later faced Rome head-on. Though their kingdoms fell, their legacy endured, woven into the history of the Balkans and beyond. The story of the Illyrians is one of resilience, of a civilization that stood between worlds, never entirely dominated until the rise of an empire too vast to resist. They remind us that even peoples remembered as outsiders often shaped the destiny of the great powers they encountered.